Hello, and welcome to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, Integrity Deficit Disorder. We have as our guest today, lucky to have our guest today, Perry Zern and Dani Bassett. They are authors of their book, Curious Minds, The Power of Connection. Are you all there?
Yes, we're here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It really is. Part of this for me, I assume that they told you that I also have twin sons, and of course now they just turned 52 last week.
A little older.
Yeah, a little older. That's right. But they, the memories are still there, and I can ask you about some of those things to see if you guys had the same sort of partnership, I should say.
Absolutely.
Was the opportunity there that you then had when you were young and you started making noises? Did you create your own language? Did you have your own language?
Yes.
And if you did so, how did you carry it on? How long was it that you did that?
We definitely had our own language, and we spoke to one another in ways that we understood and other people didn't.
Right.
And we also, even much longer than the length of time that language lasted, we have been able to understand what each other is thinking and feeling in very uncanny ways. So that sort of knowledge of one another, I think, has stuck with us for much longer. But Perry, I don't know when it ended. That's a good question. I'm not sure I can put a date to that.
Yeah, I don't know. But one of the things that we like to talk about writing this book together as a new kind of shared language together, right. As we've been trained in two different fields, Dani in neuroscience and physics, and me in philosophy and more humanities stuff. And learning how to write together was kind of its own challenge, but I think we've come up with our own voice, and it is really a new language.
Well, it's no surprise that you carry it with you to some degree. In that, I can still remember my boys doing the same thing, and it was yeah. That's how it went, back and forth between those two, and it helped me because then certain things need to be done, like food and diapers and things like that. But it was they grew up with that. For me, I was lucky in that I coached all the sports. I had a pitcher and a catcher. I had an end and a quarterback. I had 2-point guards. I had wherever game I was working at it, and that same kind of what do we do next carries on. It carries on now, and I'll stop talking about my own. But they now live about 4 or 5 minutes apart.
And that's my dream. Someday.
We're a little jealous. We live about 2 hours, which is not bad for being adults and having careers, but it still feels too far.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with that. I'm with you. But then again, you never know. When you turn 52, you might be living together next door.
Goals. When we're 52, we'll be 4 minutes apart.
Let's see. In terms of using the language, and as you see, the two of you interact in terms of the book is well put together. I read this morning. I read the preface and the introduction, which was a big help for me in knowing the how you guys rotated on the chapters. That's I can't hardly talk about it. It's fantastic. So you
Yeah,
want
we
to
really
explain?
enjoyed
Go ahead.
we really enjoyed having it be somewhat of a dialogue between our disciplines. So I wrote the first chapter on the science of curiosity, and then Perry came had a response in the second chapter on the philosophical takes, and then we continued back and forth. But it's also the case that those were the initial people who drafted the chapters, but then we both went through each of our chapters and made edits and made suggestions and expanded things. So what you find in the book still holds the scaffold of a dialogue, but feels as if it was written more by one person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perry?
Yeah, I think, we talked, we should tell a little bit about the backstory of how we even came to this book,
That's a good
I mean,
idea.
we had a,
That comes next.
Oh, okay, that comes next. Okay. Well, then go to that next, and then I'll sort of tell more of the story.
Well, when did you start? When did you get the idea? How long had you been looking at it? Right at it. Just go for it.
Yeah, so we grew up being homeschooled. So, which means in our case, anyway, we had an incredible amount of freedom in what we could learn and how we could learn it. It was very student-driven sort of learning with very little kind of disciplinary trappings that would constrain what it is that we could ask and how we could ask it. And so that kind of freedom, I think, really connected us very, very deeply to curiosity itself. We ended up, obviously, as twins must, kind of define our differences a little bit as we come into young adulthood. And so Dani, went into physics, and I went into philosophy, which in a sense are polar opposites, right? As far into the sciences and into the humanities as you could get. But it turns out when you go that far, it's almost like going around the world, right? You actually get really, really close. So physics and philosophy have long been called themselves twin disciplines, oddly enough, because they both try to answer really fundamental things about the world and about what it means for things to exist. And so as we were specializing in physics and philosophy, we started to talk, in grad school and in Dani's kind of early postdoc career about our interests. I was already studying the philosophy of curiosity. Dani was studying the neuroscience of neural flexibility or brain flexibility, and how it contributed to learning. So we were already thinking about learning kind of in our own fields and curiosity specifically. And we thought, you know what, let's put our heads together. Two does tend to be better than one. Let's see what we can come up with that would be a really transdisciplinary theory of curiosity. And that's what this book is.
Well, I can imagine the two of you working well together.
Yes,
it is, and it shows. It shows as you're here. Each of you is, I think, happy to have done the book, and especially now that it's launched. And you're going to see a lot of the books, a lot of interviews, I think, and hope.
Yeah, it's definitely something that was, I think, a high point of our careers thus far. It was just a lot of fun.
Well, let's hope that it goes on and 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 on.
Yeah, I mean, it was just so wonderful to have an excuse to have to set up meetings, with your twin for work. I mean,
oh yeah,
that's just fantastic.
Yeah. Now the introduction, I wasn't able to read the whole book, but I intend to have my wife read it. She's an engineer from Cornell, and she'll like this kind of a book. I was having to breathe hard just for my, to fuel my brain when I was going through it. And I had my phone with me for the dictionary. There's a lot of words in there for an old man.
Yeah, we happen to love words, and we both happen to love dictionaries and collect them on our own. So it's one of our shared habits. So you do see that a little bit in the book, our love of words.
But it's just creative. That's all it is, just creative. Now let's talk about chapter 1. The science of curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, so the science of curiosity is really exciting right now. And I'll focus mostly, I guess, on the neuroscience of curiosity. The questions that are being asked include, for example, is there a piece of the brain that is the curiosity piece of the brain, so that when you're curious, there's one piece of the brain that lights up and you can see it on a MRI scan, and you could sort of write that story up in the New York Times, and it would be nice and clean. However, it turns out that the science of curiosity is more complicated. There isn't a single piece of the brain that lights up when you're curious. There's actually a whole set of different brain regions, almost like a constellation, and interesting patterns of connections between those regions that light up or are used when you are curious. So one of the things that the field is doing right now is trying to figure out what each piece does and why it's that set of regions and not some other set of regions. And the answers are so far pretty complicated. So in fact, there are some people in the field of curiosity who are sort of throwing up their hands and saying, oh, curiosity is sort of too complicated. And in particular, we don't really know what the definition of curiosity is. So how do we define laboratory experiments that will drive curiosity and not something else like motivation or creativity or insight or innovation? How do we separate these things? So reaching that point where scientists are sort of throwing up their hands and saying, maybe we don't even know what this thing is yet, drove me to sort of have a lot more curiosity about Perry's discipline in philosophy and think, is it the case that there is a definition in philosophy that would help us as scientists to more carefully clarify our laboratory experiments? And maybe then we will see a little bit more in the neuroimaging data that we can understand. So that is sort of the that's where we get to at the end of chapter 1 to say, science is sort of a little bit stuck here. Maybe philosophy can help.
Well, maybe so. What do you say, Perry?
Yeah, I said a resounding yes. Happy to help. So the wonderful thing about philosophy is that we can analyze, definitions of curiosity that are thousands and thousands of years old. And I was able to go back, and although we see a very regular kind of characterization of curiosity as this desire to acquire new pieces of information, right? You Google something because you want to know something in particular. There's also a more fundamental definition in philosophy, and that is that curiosity is a capacity to connect ideas and experiences. So that's really, that ends up being the foundation of our book for the rest of the chapters going forward. Curiosity is a capacity to connect. So you can imagine, I might see an acorn, I might see a squirrel, but the minute that I put 2 and 2 together, that I make a connection, that acorns are fuel for squirrels, right?
Right.
Then I understand. I have been curious enough to develop a level of knowledge about the 2 things. They're not just separate facts kind of floating in my brain, but that now they're actually understanding and knowledge because I've built a connection through curiosity. So that's what we propose in the book, is a new definition of curiosity as capacity to connect.
Chapter 2, curiosity as edge work. That's your department, I guess. If Dani had the chapter 1, what's an edge work? Tell me what edge work is.
Yeah, so this is how we describe precisely that redefinition I was just describing. We say curiosity is this capacity to connect. Another way to say that is that it's edge work. Now, the word edge we're using in a specific way. It's not like you go to the edge of the world and fall off it, right? It's not that kind of edge. Rather, we're talking about the edges that make up networks. Think of a social network. Think of your relationship with your friends. The people in the social network are called nodes in network theory. So the people are the nodes, and the relationships between the people are the edges. So when we say curiosity is edge work, we mean that curiosity builds relationships of understanding between concepts and ideas and experiences.
Interesting. Did auras approach that edge work? Aura?
I don't know what aura is.
Aura, people as children, people see colors in people around them, certain ways, certain auras, and as children grow up, they don't use it So they forget about it. And by the time they're, 4 years old, 5 years old, they're moving on in this, whatever it is, anti-aura society, because you can tell the disposition of someone regarding that. And if they're kind or if they're not, it's and the colors will show it. And children even today, if they're young enough, if there's a bad person near them, they'll start crying. They'll start crying. And if there's another person that's also is happy, then they are also happy. They smile. I mean, in restaurants, I always smile at the kids, and they smile back.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a good point, because I think it shows that children have this curiosity capacity to make connections in the world, some of which they might forget how to make. I mean, I think that's part of what you're bringing up with respect to the auras. So I think we can have instinctive capacities of curiosity that allow us to put two and two together and imagine connections and see connections and experience connections that might be dulled by certain forms of education.
Okay, chapter 3, the network paradigm.
Yeah, so once you start thinking about curiosity's capacity to connect ideas and connect people, then you want to ask the question as a scientist, how do I take that back into science, and how do I understand what kinds of connections people are making? So I want you to imagine for a second that you're looking at the Eiffel Tower. And there's a connection between each of the rods that's present in the Eiffel Tower. And now I want you to imagine that you're looking at telecommunications scaffold here in America. And you know that the scaffold for the telecommunications piece is quite different in its architecture than the Eiffel Tower. But if I asked you exactly how they're different, you would have to tell me something about the pattern of connections between the rods, right? So an interesting question for us is there a way for us to describe different patterns of connections between rods, in that case, between people, between ideas, between concepts? And if we can, then that would help us to understand how different people are curious differently. And it turns out that there's a beautiful new mathematical language that allows us to talk about these connection patterns, and it's called network science. So what we do is that we use network science to understand and quantify and characterize scientifically the patterns of connections between ideas that each of us have. One example of how we have this pattern of connections between ideas is one where you can ask how your mind moves from idea to idea. So for example, you can do what's called a free association task, which is where you start with an idea and then move to the next available idea in your mind, whatever occurs to you. So you might start with squirrel and then acorn and then nut and then peanut allergies and then medicine and then surgery, and then I don't know where you go from there. But this pattern of connections is something that your mind is doing all the time. And that walking process is actually illustrating for you how ideas are connected in your mind. So chapter 3 is really about trying to understand how ideas are connected in your mind using network science.
Right. Good definition. It says here, construct testable hypotheses for future empirical work.
Yes.
That kind of sums up the chapter. Okay, Perry, you're up. Chapter 4. Curiosity's got style.
Yeah, so once we have all of this on the table, right, the curiosity is actually a capacity to make connections, and we can understand this from a network perspective and building knowledge networks in our brains. Then the question is, well, if curiosity allows us to build connections, if you look at architectures all over our world, there are different styles. There's different kinds of houses. There's different styles of buildings. There's different styles of bridges. When we start to build things, we typically build them in different ways. And the same is true of knowledge. So we wanted to really focus in on some of the differences in how each of us uses our curiosity and builds our knowledge together. And so we identify 3 different styles. The first is the butterfly, who's somebody who loves to know anything and everything about anything. I mean, they're just curious without curiosity, without walls, you know. And they're the sort of person who probably has a lot of tabs open on their computer, is constantly talking and chatting with other people. That's how they get their information. So that's the butterfly. Then there's the hunter, who's someone who's far more focused, tends to be more of a loner, you know, somebody who really wants to know a lot about a little and get some real expertise on it. And they're hard to distract from that focus. And lastly, there's the dancer. And the dancer is somebody who's really creative about their curiosity. They like to ask the what if, why not, let's try it kinds of questions. And they're the ones who tend to be the most innovative of the three. So those are the three styles that we explored together.
Right. I even saw some hand-drawn pictures in the book on a page with those. And it's on the cover. If you look at it, it's on the cover as well. Front cover. Let's see. Dani, chapter 6. Curiosity
Yes.
takes a walk. Does that mean they're got a 15-minute break or something?
Curiosity Takes a Walk is actually one of Perry's. I think that
Oh, it is.
Yeah, in between the styles of
Oh,
curiosity.
you're right. You're right. I'm sorry. Let's back up.
That's fine.
Chapter 5. I jumped
Webs of
ahead.
knowledge.
Webs of knowledge.
Yeah.
I'm
So
sorry.
no, don't worry at all. So Webs of Knowledge talks a little bit about if we have these three styles of curiosity that Perry has excavated from the philosophical literature over the past 2,000 years, we can ask, are those styles the same that we have today? Or is it the case, for example, that technology has ruined us forever and there's no possibility that we have the same curiosity that people had 2,000 years ago, right? So that's an interesting question to ask. So what we do together actually is that we have a set of research projects that have tried to determine whether we have those same styles of curiosity. I should mention actually that the 7 years of research went into this book actually, and 23 scholarly articles together. So we've been working on this for a long time. But this particular part was also done in collaboration with David Lyden Staley, who's a professor of communications at Penn. And what he did is that he had participants browse Wikipedia for 15 minutes a day for 21 days. And we cataloged which Wikipedia pages they were moving between. And then we could ask, are they moving between similar Wikipedia pages? Are they hunting down one particular piece of information along a track? Or are they bouncing around kind of more like the butterfly and going from Wikipedia page to Wikipedia page that are not related at all? So for example, from the page for rhododendrons to the page for jute boxes. And so what we find is that humans today are browsing Wikipedia in a diversity of ways, but along a continuum from people who are very busybody-like, making sort of much larger leaps between pages, to people who are much more hunter-like. So people who are walking between pages that are more similar. For example, spending all 21 days focusing on work or pages about the royal family, or spending all 21 days on pages about Jewish history, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So what we find is that these archetypes that Perry has, or styles that Perry excavated from previous literatures, are definitely alive and well today. So technology has not ruined us forever. I say that tongue.
Let's hope not. Okay, Perry, chapter 6. Curiosity takes a walk.
Yeah, so here, I wanted to dig back into the many years of folks thinking about curiosity and walking. So, I mean, if you think about environmentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry Thoreau, right? People who go out into the woods to explore, to think, to imagine a different way of being. There's just this long tradition of thinking of walking as a way of being curious, and also of being curious as a way of walking. So we want to kind of tease out that double relationship. And so one of the things that I propose in this chapter is that when we're curious, we're actually walking into new landscapes of ideas, right?
Right.
We're really trying to explore new mountains, new valleys of ideas, of ways of looking at the world. Curiosity is a way of walking intellectually. And I think that that's it's helpful in all kinds of ways, but in particular, it helps us think about the places we can walk are all very different. There's lots of geographies and topologies of ideas in which we can walk. And then each of us might take a different path through that landscape. And that allows us to talk about, again, the diversity of curiosity. That some of us, when it comes to trying to learn math, for example, are going to take a different path than other folks. And it's different paths are going to work for different students. And that seems helpful as a framework.
Well, it's I was looking here, some environmental walk, political walk, spiritual walk, a lot of things can come about with this and for this. Okay, Dani, chapter 7, your brain on curiosity.
Yeah. So this is where we have a chance to sort of go back to the beginning of the book and ask, with this new definition of curiosity about, that it's a power to connect ideas and people, does that help us to rethink which brain regions are important and how your brain actually allows you to be curious? So it turns out that there's some beautiful work coming out of the field that shows that there are pieces of your brain that encode whether two ideas or objects are connected with one another, and also by how far away they are from one another. So when Perry says that when we are thinking, we're taking a walk through an idea space, what we find in the neuroscience is that people are moving through ideas that have particular distances and that are connected or not connected. And that's all encoded in a piece of the brain that's called the hippocampus. The hippocampus, interestingly, is also the region of the brain that helps us to navigate physical space. So it's the piece of the brain that helps us to navigate trails on the local mountain or navigate roadways in our town. Well, it turns out that's also the region that helps us to think through the connections and distances between ideas. So it helps us sort of walk in idea space. Good.
I like it. I don't like walking down the hall though, because I missed the door. It was open partially. Okay, final chapter, Perry. Reimagining education.
Yeah, in this final chapter, we really want to think about why what we're saying matters for sort of everyday life, right? And so we really focus on education in the closing chapter. If curiosity is a capacity to make connections, and if we all make those connections between ideas in different ways, then our classrooms, right, our spaces of learning and education need to be equipped to handle that kind of diversity of ways of making knowledge. And right now, we would say they aren't. So whether we're talking about preschool, K through 12, college, where we work, right? Typically, professors and teachers kind of cater to one or two ways of knowing or being curious. And they don't really appreciate the incredible variety of ways of being curious that are represented in their own classrooms. And so we make a final call in this last chapter to say, we need to open our minds a little bit more and to think about the many, many different ways in which people are curious, the many different kind of learning capacities and learning differences that are represented in our students. And we need to expand our pedagogical methods accordingly.
Right. I got that. Well, Dani, we're out of chapters, but you can tell my audience and my listeners where they can go to find your book. It's
absolutely, yeah. So the book is called Curious Minds, The Power of Connection, and you can get it on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, from your local bookshop, from MIT Press, which is the publisher. So anywhere you typically get your books is where you can find Curious Minds, The Power of Connection.
Well, it certainly is it's a piece of work. And what's exciting about it is that there's a lot more to come. And the more that comes, the more it just picks up inertia is how it works for me. And I'm glad that both of you guys are it. It's a good thing, and I'm glad to have you as my guest today. Very much so, had a good time. My listeners, I'm glad they tuned in too. And I want to thank my listeners for tuning in and for searching for integrity. And so long and happy trails to all.